Good morning, everybody. This is the 24th in the Biodiversity Informatics Training Curriculum Global Online Seminar Series in Biodiversity Informatics. Today we have the good fortune of having Donald Hobern speaking. He'll be speaking about the history of the Global Biodiversity Informatics Information Facility. So I'm very happy that we are continuing our series on the history of biodiversity informatics with this seminar. I'm going to put up just briefly an email address to which you can send questions for Donald. And I would urge you to send your questions during the seminar, because oftentimes the seminar speaker wraps up and the questions come in just a little bit too late to get them answered while we are online. So if a question comes to your mind, please go ahead and ask it once and for all when it comes to mind. And then at the end, I will read those questions to Donald. So please go ahead, use this email address once and for all. I will, let's see, back to me. I'll give you just a bit of an introduction to Donald. He's been working for more than 20 years in software development and biodiversity informatics. I don't want to say began because I don't know the earliest history, but definitely Donald has been with GBIF since its earliest inception, working at GBIF as a technical lead in 2002 for about 5-6 years. Then he served as the chair of TADWIG, and then as the inaugural director of the Atlas of Living Australia, and now is back at GBIF as executive secretary. So this is a person with long experience in this field, and certainly ideally suited to give us a historical perspective on this largest scale single data portal for biodiversity informatics. So Donald, thank you for accepting the invitation and challenge to take on this topic, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Town. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. I can certainly hear myself. I'll go straight over to my PowerPoint presentation and try and pick up as we go. There we are. This talk, as Town has indicated, is titled A History of GBIF. In fact, it's going to be very much a partial history of GBIF, and I hope that if there are matters which you would like to explore that I don't touch on, that you do indeed send questions, and I'll do my best either to answer them or to provide subsequent answers that Town can circulate with you. GBIF has been in existence now for about 15 years, and I do find it a useful opportunity just to look back over that period and consider where we've come from, what has changed, and some of the things that remain very difficult problems that we're still struggling to resolve. For myself, my background prior to this, other than lifelong passion for natural history, was as a software developer working for IBM, and it was from a role of that kind that I originally applied to be one of the first program officers working for the Secretariat, the GBIF Secretariat, back in 2002. So there are things that happened before I was involved, and I'll do my best to talk about them because I think they are important and give good perspective. But I'm not going to be able to talk about all aspects of a history. So I've already said this is going to be partial. I'll actually focus primarily on the things that I think are interesting and give us lessons from what has happened with GBIF during its existence. I would also emphasize this because I'm sure there'll be points later on when I'd kick myself for not having said this, but everything that I will talk about represents the work of very many people, the intellectual contributions of lots of bright people, the financial and data and informatics contributions of many different institutions and organizations. I'm not going to attempt to credit them all. I would particularly like to thank the GBIF Secretariat staff throughout its existence, because GBIF has been fortunate to be able to recruit a wide range of extremely talented people from around the world. And most of all, I want to thank the GBIF nodes and data publishers, without whom none of this would happen. So just going back to the beginning, in 1999, there was a report that was issued by the OECD Megascience Forum. It was looking at two key areas of biological informatics. Separate subgroups had been working on these areas to come up with recommendations for the kind of infrastructure responses that might be needed to address these big biological science areas with the tools they needed in the 21st century. One of those was neuroinformatics, and the other was biodiversity informatics. And as you can see from this contents page of the report, it was already talking about a need for a global biodiversity information facility. And this was then, of course, followed by a series of meetings from a number of representatives from different countries who were enthusiastic about this idea, until it got to the point of GBIF being brought into existence a couple of years later. The report from the OECD, other than a real passion for using bold and underline and italics in all sorts of exciting ways, has a very forward-looking vision that I think still represents what we're trying to achieve more broadly through biodiversity informatics and specifically through GBIF, to develop a distributed system of interlinked and interoperable modules, databases, software, networking tools, search engines, analytical algorithms, etc., that together will form a GBIF. And it talks about the kind of areas in research and what we might today call sustainable development that such a system should underpin. The report also gave an initial view of where a global biodiversity information facility might fit within the landscape of biological data and broader environmental data sets with which it would ideally connect. On the left of this diagram that I'm presenting now, you can see 4 key content areas that were considered in this report to be essential as part of biodiversity informatics. And right at the heart of this is what is here referred to as the catalogue of names of known organisms. In other words, the framework of scientific names and classifications, synonymy, and links out to common names and other identifiers for species that provides the organizational framework for the vast majority of the information that natural history collections and many involved in species observation are obviously gathering. And associated with that, there were 3 areas that I'll return to later that were identified as other key areas for GBIF focus. A focus on biological specimen data, and note the emphasis there on specimens, species bank, species level information, and biodiversity literature resources. Just over 2 years later, 2.5 years later, following a series of early proto-governing board meetings for GBIF, the organization was brought into existence with the model that it still fundamentally has. The foundation of this is that at its heart, GBIF is a collaboration between governmental bodies around the world that are together committed to the idea of free and open access to biodiversity information. And so the basis on which GBIF exists is that a number of these countries have signed a shared memorandum of understanding, which places on them some non-binding obligations to contribute money proportionate to the national GDP of their country, to promote free and open access to data, and to operate GBIF nodes within their own countries. Associated with that, there are other countries which are committed to the same goals and have signed the Memorandum of Understanding, but have not made the commitment to any kind of financial contribution and do not receive a vote in the GBIF governing board. Alongside that, from its beginning, GBIF incorporated the membership of a range of international organizations that were aligned with its mission. If you look at this historical view from 2001 to the present day, you can see that the number of countries that have been involved as voting participants has grown about 50% since those early days. There's been one or two cases in which countries, for various financial reasons in particular, changes in government, etc., have been obliged to step down from voting participation. But at its heart, we've had a decade and a half of remarkably stable governance and funding, certainly at a lower level each year than the governing board hopes to commit, but stable enough to maintain an infrastructure through this period. The orange section represents the number of countries that are associated as associate participants without actually making financial contributions. And the blue part represents the varying number of international organizations that have also signed the Memorandum of Understanding. You may note that this seems to have a little bit of a sawtooth shape, rising and then dropping down and then rising again. This is because until 2012, GBIF operated under a new Memorandum of Understanding every 5 years. We're now in what we trust will be a more stable model with a fixed Memorandum of Understanding that is indefinite, and countries and organizations that sign that are not obliged to go through the process every 5 years of re-signing. Here's the map of existing participants. Just to explain, the purple ones are countries which remain participants, but where for various political reasons they still haven't signed the most current Memorandum of Understanding. If you look at this map and you compare it with the map of data on the GBIF portal, you'll see very strong correlations that the regions in which we have the strongest and most stable and most comprehensive participation at the national level are also, not surprisingly, those for which we have the most consistent and richest data sets. And the regions which on this map just appear as pale grey, a large part of Asia, sections of Africa and the Middle East, and parts of Eastern and Southern Europe are ones where the coverage is typically much less. I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but if you visit the GBIF website, you can certainly see the full list of countries that are now participants and the set of other associate participants. These are the organizational bodies that with which GBIF has assigned Memorandum of Understanding. And if you look at that list of bodies, it indicates the breadth of areas with which GBIF is interacting and some of the challenges of our supporting such a wide set of stakeholders. Some of these are very much focused on science, taxonomy, biodiversity research in various areas. Others are bodies such as Species 2000 or the Biodiversity Heritage Library, Encyclopedia of Life, which are offering associated data infrastructures and databases with which GBIF seeks to cooperate. Others are approaching GBIF from the angle of conservation and governmental decisions around the use of biodiversity. And there's a broader spread there as well. For these reasons, GBIF is currently in the process of trying to have slightly more specific memoranda of understanding with those associate participants with which it has a real need in the near future to be aligning work programs more closely. Looking at this period, at least back to 2008, in a different way, one of the things that has been very steady, so you may see a slight increase in more recent years, but fundamentally there's a reasonably steady growth year on year in the amount of data here in the form of species occurrence records, which has been added to the network. Associated with that, we've also been seeing since the beginning a remarkably steady growth in the number of peer-reviewed publications each year, which make direct reference to having made use of GBIF as the source of some of the data that have fed into their analyses and conclusions. And so, although back in 2008, it was relatively hard to demonstrate clearly that the investments in GBIF were making significant difference to researchers and to the broader landscape. Today, we're certainly confident that with much still to fix and improve, that GBIF is highly relevant and that the global network collaborating to share these data is a functional and important entity. I just wanted, before going into some things that I think are actually much more interesting, just to dig a little bit more into the growth in data in various ways, because I think we can see several things that represent changes that have happened in GBIF over the years, or represent some of the issues that we've still got to face. This is a view. Most of these charts I'm going to be showing come from the GBIF portal under the Explore Data Statistics section. And this shows from 2008 to the current day for a number of different dates through that period. You can see the dots in the line along the top. The proportion of species or apparent species, some of these are clearly binomials which have not been fully reviewed by taxonomists in the given groups, but the vast majority of these do represent recognized species. You can see that animals are obviously a continually growing section of the data, a larger and larger proportion. Plants, perhaps not surprisingly, given the origins of GBIF with a large number of herbarium data sets brought together, and with the lower number of plant species growing somewhat more slowly. Taking this from the angle of species occurrences rather than the number of species recorded, we can see much more clearly, though, that increasingly the biggest contributions to GBIF year on year are in animals and particularly birds. This is not a surprise because in the more recent period, a larger and larger proportion of the data have been coming from citizen science sources. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that GBIF was originally seen as an infrastructure for providing access to specimen data, and the focus at that stage was very, very narrowly on natural history collections and specimens. Over time, we've adjusted this perspective to recognize that GBIF has twin roles, one of which is to support the integration of collections data, but a very closely related one is to provide an evidence base for the recorded occurrence of species in time and space. And as a result of that, we are integrating many sources of data that were somewhat outside that initial focus. And as you can see, animals are therefore an increasingly significant proportion. This graph takes things in a different way and tells a different story. At the top, we have a view of the data that were held in GBIF in 2007, the end of 2007, arranged from left to right according to the year in which the organism was recorded. So roughly, I think it's 1950 is the first point on this graph, running right to 2007. In that particular case, you can see that even at that point, there were clearly more records from more recent years than there were from earlier years. And if we project right the way out into the very earliest periods from which specimens and observations have flowed into GBIF, then that number continues to dwindle. But if you look at the subsequent time periods, the second to fifth rows in this diagram, which represent respectively late 2010, late 2013, 2016, right at the beginning, and about 2 months ago, you can see that the proportion of the data in GBIF, which comes from a very recent period, is growing really, really rapidly. And it's also noticeable, I think, that the slope of the leading edge of these graphs is getting steeper and steeper. Again, this is an indication of the increasing importance of citizen science data, much of which is naturally very, very recent, and also of the reduction in the lag time before those data start to enter the network. Bodies such as eBird and iNaturalist are contributing data on a very short turnaround time into the network. So much for growth in volumes, but one of the real issues that we need to address, and which I'll be talking a little bit more about in a minute, is the challenge of going from the earliest days of GBIF, which was trying to take any suitable data sets that were publicly shared and bring them together, towards trying to offer an increasingly well-curated knowledge base on biodiversity occurrence. So just a few quick views to show how things have remained largely the same in terms of proportions over the period. It's obviously important for many, many users, the vast majority of users of GBIF data, that there are good and accurate and precise identifications associated with the records. You can see that as of today, there's still about 50 million records in the network that are only identified to the level of genus or a higher rank than that. But the vast majority continue to be identified with a binomial or infraspecific rank. The proportion of data which are associated with coordinates and a country is also significant, but as you might expect, given the contribution from natural history collections, where interpretation of country from labels may not always be easy, that there is a noticeable proportion for which even the country isn't known, and a rather larger proportion where we don't have coordinates for the records. That doesn't mean that these records in this range are useless. Some of them may be types or other important collected materials for those species of very high interest to taxonomists and others, but their use in understanding biodiversity patterns is clearly much more limited. If we try and think about what we know of the date of occurrence, things get a little worse again, and this is again a sign of the incomplete or missing dates on some specimens, especially that we have records where we know the year, or we know the year and the month, but also quite a noticeable proportion where we have no idea when this organism was recorded. We can slice these things other ways as well. It's noticeable that, as illustrated here, the vast majority of species in the GBIF network are still only recorded from a very small number of locations. This simply maps for every species in the network at any time the proportion which are only recorded from 1.1 degree cell, or 2 to 20 cells, all the way down to, at the bottom, those which have more than 1,000 such cells. Things like Passer domesticus, house sparrow, fit into that category. It's a reflection, obviously, of the reality of many species being highly localized. It's also a strong indication that the volumes of data flowing from many taxonomic groups is still highly restricted. There are those that are very well recorded and those that are much less so. So, standing back from that, I mean, that's a rather dry perspective on where GBIF has come, the fact that things have been growing, that we have an understanding of some of the weaknesses from certain perspectives in the data that are coming together. But I'd just like to look at the stages through which GBIF has come to get to this point. And in doing so, I felt a little chastened, or I wouldn't say depressed, but a little reflective to realize just how much we've been struggling with exactly the same things throughout this 5-year period. If we turn the clock back to 2003, GBIF published its first strategic plan. The strategic plan reflected the structure of the GBIF Secretariat at that time. We had 4 program areas that we were working on, each with their own program officer. The first of these was called DADI. I campaigned long and hard to get that name changed. Data access and database interoperability, which was my responsibility. And the focus of this was collaborating particularly with TADWIG on understanding how we should be trying to model data that flowed into GBIF, what tools and data standards we should be adopting and promoting, and fundamentally interacting with the existing biodiversity informatics community to build this system. Secondly, there was the DigitWork program, which received the largest levels of funding at this point, with significant seed money each year that was put into small-scale projects in various institutions to digitize their collections and to make them available through the GBIF network. Thirdly, the electronic catalogue of names of known organisms, ECAT, which again operated at this stage a seed money program to try to get checklists, global level particularly, checklists prepared for some of the taxonomic groups that were not then already covered, particularly through Species 2000 and ITIS Catalogue of Life. And lastly, certainly not least, outreach and capacity building, or OCB, where the focus was on trying to build connections with countries that were not yet part of the GBIF network, and dealing with the development and circulation of information materials, training materials, to support data publishers, national nodes, and others in getting involved in GBIF. So all of these, with perhaps significantly less emphasis now on ECAT, and certainly much less money proportionately than we had back then for seed funding, remain key activities for GBIF. And during this first period, in 2006, GBIF used these energies and these investments to put together the first version of a GBIF data portal. I'll talk about a few of the aspects in a minute of how this was working and some of the things that right now seem very deep history. But this is what it looked like for a particular species, for the sandwich tern. We made use of a mapping service that was provided and hosted by the Belgian Biodiversity Information Facility. We invoked a service they offered using HTTP GET requests with a whole load of coordinates embedded in the URL, and received back, I can't remember whether JPEGs or GIFs, representing maps like these that we then cached and stored on the various pages. The maps were simple, but clearly bear a great deal of resemblance to some of the things that we've been doing ever since. Scrolling down the same page, there were rather dense fields of links and ways to navigate further that, again, reflected the kind of things that you can still largely do through the GBIF portal. There was a higher classification, taken in this case from the Catalogue of Life, from ITIS, ability to go and view this in a view of the ITIS checklist, and indeed to provide feedback on any of these names and classifications. There were a bunch of names that we simply found as part of harvesting specimen records, and which we interpreted as being somehow synonyms or infraspecific taxa within this species, and they're listed there with the opportunity for feedback. A few common names and some problems obviously there with code pages in handling the Spanish. And then the bread and butter of this, which was the breakdown of the records that we'd harvested by country and by data set, and the ability to filter them either by those that had coordinates or all records. So looking back a decade here, we're talking about a set of functions which was more basic, certainly wouldn't have scaled to the kind of volumes of data that GBIF is now facing, but where the kind of functions that GBIF was trying to offer were really broadly similar to where we are today. At the end of that period, GBIF moved into its second phase, and again, had a strategic plan, which is summarized here. It now shifted away from the four areas that had been identified initially as work program areas, and focused on three key axes of development for the network. One of these is clearly content. GBIF exists to support the mobilization and access for biodiversity information. We're not here just to build informatics. We're not here just to build a human network. Those two areas are in support of enabling the free flow of content. There were ambitious views there of how far we should get in that 5-year period, and the failure to meet a 95+% complete catalogue of life, or electronic catalogue of names and known organisms by 2011. Clearly we didn't achieve that. And it was also talking of between 500 and 1 billion records in the network by 2011. The other areas, again, reflect ongoing things that we're continuing to do, trying to improve the tools and services we offer, improving the access and the fitness of use of data, and trying to build the network by bringing in more participants. And again, this period was reflected by the development of another data portal, and the key changes that were added at this point were a certain amount of multilingual support. We had translations of the user interface of this portal from several GBIF participant countries, and the implementation of a set of web services which then allowed others in various ways either to embed just the raw data, sliced in various ways into their tools and applications and portals, or to access maps and Google Earth KML layers. There was more of a tutorial instead of documentation about this portal as well. And this remained in place probably for about 5 years with certainly greater scalability than the previous portal and a growth towards what we have today. In 2012, we entered the period of GBIF's existence that we're in now, running until the end of this year. Again, the structuring of our work was organized according to these three key axes: content, infrastructure, informatics, and engagement. And I think there's more explicitly a focus that started to come in during this period on trying to understand where are the gaps in the data, where are the gaps that matter, how to understand and address issues around the quality of data, and also starting to think about what are the future streams of information that could and should be harvested within GBIF. And of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with the look and feel of the current portal. This has been, unlike the others, something which we've been steadily enhancing and maintaining through the last few years with additional features. It's been more fully integrated with other aspects of GBIF's work. It used to be that we maintained separate communications and data portals. Now they are the same site, gbif.org. The ability to, the web services have been enhanced, and many of the limits that used to exist for accessing and downloading and using data have been removed, so that now you are able to download all 650 million records in the network and make use of them externally. We've also been putting a lot more focus on solving some of the issues around citation and references for data, which positions us right now at the point where we're starting to look towards the future. The next 5-year period, we have the text for a strategic plan that I hope will be available as a document for wider consumption very soon. In this case, we've identified 5 broad areas where GBIF really has to focus on making a difference during this period, one of which is trying to work with external communities that are dependent on biodiversity data to ensure that we understand their needs and take their priorities more fully into account, and that the tools and services we're offering and the content are, as far as possible, the things that they need. Underpinning that are 2 areas, data quality and data gaps, where we recognize that significant work is still needed to further advance the kind of tools we're offering to make sure that anybody downloading data from GBIF can have a reasonable understanding of how well validated those data may be, and be able to make at least some upfront assessments of whether the available data are likely to be suitable for the scale and the nature of the analyses that they wish to carry out. Behind that is the 4th goal in this plan, to enhance our biodiversity information infrastructure, the focus there being on better interaction with other major infrastructures in genomics, the Catalogue of Life, Biodiversity Heritage Library, EOL, etc., so that we're not operating as separate, disconnected entities, but that we are producing together a meaningful, well-integrated, and rationally clear global knowledge base for biodiversity. And sitting Fifth in this list, but still really the only way that GBIF is going to be able to proceed, is supporting the network, national level activities in particular, so that all of the problems that GBIF is trying to resolve at the global level around removing friction between the sources of biodiversity data and those who need those data need to be solved at the level of every nation and probably every institution as well, if we're going to get all of the benefits that we'd like to see. So I struggled very much with how to turn this into something where there were some good historical lessons, and I thought the best thing after all of that would be to take a look at some of the changes that we've gone through and the reasons for those, and what the implications of those have been. If you remember the OECD document I showed at the beginning, it showed 4 key content areas that GBIF needed to focus on. These were the electronic catalogue of names of known organisms, natural history collections or specimen data, species bank, and digital biodiversity literature resources. In addition, there was the focus on the informatics, the data access, database interoperability to support that, and on training and outreach as 2 very obvious areas where GBIF needed to be making a difference. So there were these 7 areas that the OECD report recommended a fully funded GBIF should address. And in fact, when GBIF came into existence, the decision was taken that funding from the available participants wasn't adequate for us to do all of these things. So 4 work program areas were identified, 4 program officers were recruited. One of them had responsibility for 2 of the original areas under outreach and capacity building, and 3 of the others that were seen as particularly important starting points for GBIF, the informatics, the names, and the specimens, were areas which were started. The other 2 areas were seen as ones where hopefully GBIF would be able to pick them up as it entered its 2nd phase. In fact, if we look at this from the standpoint of the broader biodiversity informatics landscape, it's quite clear that at least 3 of these relate very strongly to things that we would see today as the missions and responsibilities of other activities. The focus on GBIF somewhat independently managing an electronic catalogue of named organisms, rather than somehow finding an early way to coordinate and support the ongoing work in the catalogue of life with Species 2000 and ITIS, was, I think, in some ways a mistake that we could have progressed much faster, and I think got a clearer solution if we'd pooled energies from the beginning. As it is today, GBIF certainly is trying to get to the stage where any content or informatics work it does around names and a taxonomic backbone is, as far as possible, going to be fused with the work of others. We don't see any value in doing this completely separately. And this is one of the areas where, especially in the next 5-year period, under that biodiversity informatics infrastructure goal, I think GBIF, Catalogue of Life, and others that are putting together these kinds of tools need to find the way to build one solution together and to deliver something where the whole community can help to improve and curate it over time. That's a big challenge, but I think it's essential. The 2 areas where GBIF did not initially receive funding were both addressed under other funding sources within the following years, and clearly what was originally conceived as Species Bank represents the kind of areas which Encyclopedia of Life has been trying to address, and Biodiversity Heritage Library is an absolutely solid response to what was foreseen as a digital biodiversity literature resource component to GBIF. So I think that the message here is that in some ways the landscape's more complicated than was foreseen for biodiversity informatics by the OECD group. This has enabled our community globally together to gain access to additional resources and to progress some of these things in ways that wouldn't have been possible if they'd just been left in the lap of GBIF. But we do need to be doing more to pull these things together. Secondly, I mentioned that GBIF was originally pictured as being a resource for natural history collection data. And indeed, in many of the early meetings where GBIF nodes especially were discussing the approach to putting content together to build GBIF, the feeling was that anything other than collections data was too unreliable to be included. The concept, I think, in some quarters was almost that field observations of all kinds were like collection data where the specimens had been lost, rather than recognizing that the strengths may be different, there may be serious weaknesses in terms of our ability to revisit and validate field data, whether from ecological research, monitoring, citizen science, or whatever, but that there was also potential for many things to be addressed only if we could combine all of these streams of information together. So GBIF started out with a vision that I think was very much on the left of this diagram. It was the idea of producing a global virtual natural history collection. But fairly rapidly, I'd say over the next few years, the balance of effort swung towards the right of this diagram, which is delivering a global evidence base for species distribution. What species have been found where and when, and what evidence do we have to make that assertion? And there's good reasons for this. It's definitely the case that the right-hand side of this diagram aligns much more naturally with the priorities and needs of many of the governments and other global funding bodies that are contributing to GBIF and biodiversity informatics generally. And therefore, there's a focus on trying to produce the data sets that can support land planning, conservation, response to climate change, etc. And that's perfectly natural. In addition, I think the advantage of addressing that right-hand side is that the nature of the data fundamentally fits three axes that have been implicit in everything I've been talking about so far. Taxonomy, which species are we talking about? Geography, where was it recorded? And time, when was it recorded? And all three of those, despite all of the problems we face with the use and interpretation of scientific names, all three of those are things which a very wide range of data sets hold in a reasonably compatible form that makes it not too hard for somebody like GBIF to pull it together, normalize further, and present as an integrated view. The challenges on the left-hand side, I think, are that clearly as we think about different taxonomic groups, the associated morphological, sequence, multimedia requirements vary quite widely. The ability to apply an ontology sufficiently clear to organize all of those data is also a bigger challenge. And so I'd say with some regret that up to this point, GBIF has in many ways not completely, and biodiversity informatics globally, has not yet completely delivered on one of the fundamental things that I think the OECD was looking for. And certainly part of my interest and one of the challenges I would like to leave with all of you, with GBIF and with the global community, is how do we get to the stage where for all as close as possible to all of the world's natural history collections, we really do have the ability to interact with them, to explore them, to form taxonomic hypotheses, to sort and even curate specimens across the internet, in the cloud, in the digital space that we all share. We're a long, long way from that, that I think is one of the most fundamental things that has been a change, not entirely a bad change, certainly. There's many good things that have been possible, but that loss of focus is, I think, is something that we need to deal with, because much of what we're doing today is taking the energies of collection managers, taxonomists, naturalists, and using it to feed the needs of agencies represented on the right. And I think if we could somehow close that circle and bring benefits more clearly to both sides, we'd probably find that the kind of infrastructures we're building more rapidly led to shared improvement and curation of the data we're all using. Another area in which things have changed has been in the technologies we've been using. GBIF was very fortunate that Tadwig was already well advanced back in 2002 in looking at many of the challenges for connecting up data from natural history collections. The earliest version of the portal I showed really was only possible because the Digger protocol, which represented by these diagrams, an XML mechanism for sending a filtered request to an endpoint and getting back a set of properties for a set of specimen records, and then subsequently the slightly richer and more complex versions represented by BioCase and the ABCD schema. Darwin Core and Digger, BioCase, and ABCD. These mechanisms were the rapid entry for GBIF to be able to put together data within the first couple of years and be able to put up maps and provide an integrated search. So this kind of query response model was the one we were following. And this is a diagram from a very early conceptual piece on what GBIF was trying to achieve through its informatics, that somebody sitting at a laptop should be able to look for records, specimen records of hedgehogs, that there should be some black box, mystical engine that knew that different places may have relevant records, and it would use Digger and send requests out to each of these, get back the records, put them all together, and return a stream of integrated records back to the user. This federated search was the concept, I think, behind GBIF in 2002. And clearly, if we'd been dealing purely with a small handful of institutions, a system like this might have worked. In practice, we almost immediately realized that this was going to be highly error-prone. The results were going to be completely unpredictable because connections to individual institutions and their databases weren't always going to be available. And so the process was decoupled so that the GBIF portal crawled these various data resources by carrying on a sort of series of 20 questions. What species do you hold in your collection? For the species in that list you've just given me, between those that start with AA and those that start with AC, how many records do you have? Give me the first 500 of them, give me the next 500 of them, and so on. It was a complex, bandwidth expensive way of building a data index, but it worked. And so then the user requests were directed purely at the index database and could be somewhat more reliable, fuller than would have been the case otherwise, while still containing the necessary information to link back to the source databases. So in fact, the net result was that users of the system were not really talking directly with all of these databases. It wasn't a federated search in that sense, although all of the pointers were there to follow through. So that was, I think, one of the key technology changes. Another related aspect which has gone on, and this is slightly more recent, is that whole 20 questions of finding what data a collection held and pulling it out a chunk at a time was horribly painful. It was error prone. For some of the biggest data sets, we would find that the entire process would collapse, some memory leak on the other side, and we'd have to restart and never necessarily complete a particular database. So not only has the network and TADWIG and GBIF over the years moved away from that federated search model, we've actually also been moving to the Darwin Core Archive as a zip of all of the materials from a resource, sharing that and treating that as the fundamental unit. This has big implications because it's obviously meant that we can start thinking much more clearly than we did before about the idea of putting these data into repositories as data sets rather than just as streams of records. It's meant that GBIF itself can start thinking about offering exactly the same format for data downloads and standardizing the kind of structures that we're offering. Darwin Core Archive is itself doubtless, certainly, a midpoint between where we were and where we will be eventually. There are new standards from W3C, etc., that need to be investigated. But this idea of shifting from endpoints where we could ask questions of a database to actually transferring the entire data set has been a really massive step forward for GBIF. Just a couple of quick things, and then I realize I've used almost a whole hour already, and I'll stop for questions. The earliest discussions we had about data sharing showed that back in 2003, probably, many collections had serious concerns about what would happen if they made their data available online. There was a definite fear that somebody would take these resources, put them onto a floppy disk probably, or a CD-ROM, and sell it and make money that otherwise the collection could have done. There were also concerns that arose around intellectual property for the data. And so GBIF started with I think, a very cautious approach to data access. And the model for most of GBIF's existence has been share through the network whatever you feel comfortable sharing, and we'll ask people to look at your metadata and see what you've said about how it can be used, and it's their responsibility to respect it. Let us know if there's any problems. This is not a 21st century, it's not a digital way of handling data exchange, and so we're now much more aggressively moving towards Creative Commons licensing. And I'm very pleased that we're now at the stage where just coming towards the end of trying to get digital licenses on all the data in GBIF, and more than 90% of data sets, more than 85% of records are either CC0 or CC BY license. I've touched on this already, and I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but we've also shifted to a more digital way of keeping track of data downloads, references to data access from the GBIF network, digital object identifiers on all source data sets and on downloads. And again, this is one aspect of a serious change from a text-based way of communicating what people expected about data towards something that can indeed support serious machine integration. Really briefly, I just wanted to mention 6 things that I think are challenges that we've faced all this time and that we've still not solved, and that together we really need to address as a community. After all the years of talking about the global names architecture, all the years of GBIF having an ECAT and struggling to contribute some intellectual and content components to the catalogue of life, the fact that we still don't have a complete taxonomic framework for all of our data is a deep concern, and something where I believe together we need to find ways to support the expert community, focus on the community rather than just the structure of the data, in delivering as early as possible a complete catalogue of scientific names and a workable and continually improving checklist that we all share for species on this planet. Unevenness in data publishing and coverage is clearly a big concern for GBIF. We've tried to open the door a little bit more by making it easier for institutions and data holders in countries that are not yet GBIF participants to share their data, but that's going to be a consistent and long-term challenge for us, and we're therefore trying to understand how we can at least characterize the data from different regions according to how rich it is and how suitable it is for representing real biodiversity patterns in those areas. This one's a bit cryptic, but I would say that our efforts in data standardization have probably stalled for, well, not completely, there's been lots of things going on, but probably for about 7 or 8 years. We've lost impetus in trying, I think, to go beyond the set of misaligned data standards we all have, Darwin Core and ABCD on the specimen side, a bunch of other TADWIG standards for other aspects of biodiversity data, and on one hand, all of those, and on the other side, the work that did go on around a biodiversity information model, an ontology for our domain, without having even the highest level concept and consistent approach to how we share all of the components of our biodiversity information. It's quite hard to make GBIF and Catalogue of Life and BHL and all the others as seamless as I'd like to see them. And I do think that there's serious things that we should be revisiting at the level of TADWIG in that space. I'll skip this one because it's really the same thing from another way. We've got to be able to link the different silos that GBIF and the others represent. Curation of data is the biggest sociological challenge of all. We face that challenge even with lists of scientific names. The challenges get much larger when you start thinking about checklists and global species database, etc. When you think about the entire pool of biodiversity information that we're trying to pull together in different forms, there's a real need to enable the expert communities, the international societies of taxonomists and others responsible for particular groups, find ways efficiently to give them a platform which enables them to use these digital resources for their own work, and where every time they make a change, they know that it's actually improving a resource that they'll be revisiting in the future. We're so far from that, it's sad. And then lastly, although this is something I think we're shifting fast towards, is the idea that it shouldn't be acceptable for any of us to live with databases that are sitting on a single server somewhere with no backup and no guarantees that anybody's going to host them in the future. There is a surprising amount of data still in the GBIF network that we harvested and indexed at some point, and where the only known web version of that is the version in the GBIF index, rather than the primary data from which we harvested it. We do need a serious long-term set of repositories and an approach to hosting and redundancy for all of our data. So I've talked way too long there. I'm going to switch off my presentation here and see what sort of questions there are, if anybody's still listening. In fact, it could all have stopped when I first started talking.
No, you're doing fine, Donald, and you have quite an audience online. We've got one question coming in now. Let's see. So this is Angela Cuervo, who is in a biodiversity informatics lab in Mexico City at UNAM. And so she's asking, I'm translating from Spanish. I wanted to know if GBIF has thought in financing projects to seek species that are poorly represented in the data portal.
Excellent question. We've been thinking a lot just recently, particularly as we prepare to move into the next 5-year period, about priorities and gaps. And clearly gaps mean different things to different people. It's very easy to look at the GBIF map and see that most of Asia, Middle East, North Africa is blank, and large parts of the oceans are, and say, these are the gaps we need to address. And there's a lot we can be doing. And I would say that one of GBIF's priorities is to engage better with anyone who's holding data on those regions. But what you describe is also a key issue. GBIF probably still sees natural history collections as the most natural source for data on a wide range of species that are poorly recorded. Certainly the taxonomic breadth of most collections is likely far to outstrip the suite of species that are being reliably recorded through citizen science or even much ecological monitoring. Right now, we're trying, first of all, to get the broad brush priorities like that established, and to try to put clearer messages that help funding bodies to be thinking about where they should be investing effort. But that's really the first step, and going beyond that, I'd like us to be in the situation where the GBIF global data resource can be explored to identify weaknesses that could be addressed by all kinds of different contributions, whether it's trying to encourage citizen scientists to revisit a site where a species was last recorded 50 years ago to see whether it's still there, or whether it's trying to recognize that there are gaps within the fauna for a particular country or flora, or alternatively, just starting to look at the cross-border aspect, because realistically, if a whole series of countries have excellent butterfly data and one of them doesn't, it may be more valuable to focus on filling that particular gap so that you can get a large regional view than it would be to focus on adding another 50 species in one of the countries that you're not going to have the similar comparability. It's a big challenge, and we're looking for bright ideas this year, especially on this. The work program is considering gaps and weaknesses and coverage of data in all dimensions as one of the things we want to understand better.
I think maybe one thing you could mention in answering Angela might be the BID and BIFA programs, which in many senses look to the big gaps.
Right, and possibly my thinking primarily about Latin America as I was responding to Angela meant that I wasn't doing that. But certainly GBIF has been fortunate in the last year or so to receive significant funding both from the European Union and from Japan for projects, especially in Africa, the Caribbean and the Pacific, and parts of East Asia, that where the money is going into content mobilization as well as capacity enhancement. And we hope that, especially with a series of projects that will soon be announced from Africa, that we'll be able to fill some of those gaps a little better than we have so far. And I'd love to find somebody that would help us do similar things in the regions that are not covered by those current grants.
So just to pass on to the audience, Tim Robertson at the GBIF Secretariat provided this link in case you're interested in some of the visuals that Donald was showing. There's a broader set available on the GBIF site. So that's at the analytics and global sublinks. And also any questions, those may be questions coming in. Any questions, there's the link to which to send them. Let me check and see if those are questions or what coming in. Yeah, Ankila said, yes, I'm thinking in Latin America, and put a smiley face after it. So,
as long as there's a smiley face. But yes, we'd love to find ways that we can support more in all regions. But
of course, but BID and BIFA have been actually pretty spectacular investments by the donor community. I had one question that I'd just toss out to you, and it's just kind of an observation maybe that I've come to. Maybe I'm wrong, but maybe I'm also a participant in this problem, which is that maybe if we were to look back at the last 20, 30 years of biodiversity informatics, I think you could build an argument that the questions that have been asked scientifically have been driven by the data and the technology that have been available.
right.
And I kind of feel like into the future, it ought to be turned on its head, and that the questions ought to start driving the technology and the data that are prioritized for development. Just wondering if you have any thoughts on that kind of axis of thinking.
Definitely, I think there will continue to be drivers from both sides. Probably the biggest one that I can see, at least for some of the taxonomic groups I know reasonably well, is that understanding and mapping biodiversity patterns is increasingly going to become much more cost effective for us using some kind of ecogenomics approaches, some of the ongoing activities that IBOL is involved in, for example, with barcoding of insects from malaise traps or organisms on the ocean floor, strike me as potentially in the near future offering us completely new views of those patterns at scales and ranges that would otherwise be just about impossible. And so I do think that we're going to find that some things continue to be driven just by where the technology takes us. At the same time, I am very interested in some of the things that have been happening particularly with GeoBond's essential biodiversity variables concept. The things that I think we'd like to be able to do are actually independent of that concept in itself, but having some sort of trigger for focusing on it is always a help. If we look across the sort of questions that we'd like to see answered, not only for those who are monographing particular groups or developing floras or faunas of regions, but also for many of the key issues which underpin sustainability questions. We really do want, more than anything else, to have the best picture we can of what species are found in a particular portion of time and space and how those compare with those in another portion of space or time. So whether it's trying to discuss what we believe to be the suite of species found in a protected area compared to a proposed mining area adjacent to it, or whether we're trying to look at time series changes and what we think we can see. The real challenge is taking all of these individual records we've got and trying to turn them into the best picture we can of the real patterns and the real changes in patterns. And if we want to do that at the level of even relatively fine scales for some groups like birds and vascular plants, in some regions, Western Europe, parts of North America, Mexico, Australia, we're probably in a situation where there are certainly groups where we can talk sensibly about the comparing which species are found at a 10 or 25 kilometer grid across the country, and may even have enough data, enough historical data, to talk about how some of those things have changed over time. Now, if I'm trying to imagine a government leader who is genuinely keen to balance all of the challenges in the Sustainable Development Goals, which includes things that we would recognize as biodiversity, but also recognizes, but also includes food, health, urbanization, energy management, etc. An enlightened leader really would need the ability to understand how biodiversity patterns across their region represent values that should be preserved as part of the biodiversity view of that, and how that can then be used as a trade-off with other things, because trade-offs are going to be necessary. And so I think the really big questions all come down, first and foremost, to how good are the data we're pulling together now at enabling us to model or predict which set of species are found at a particular scale in a particular region at some time. And that, I think, is so clearly the first and foremost question. It's a matter of developing occupancy matrices for the planet for all species, with massive lack of confidence for many regions and probably very, very coarse scales for many regions. But how do we get to that point? How do we use the really good data we have from some regions? How do we enable countries that may have very limited resources but still may have a wish to take these things into account? How do we help them to gather and organize a suitable subset or proxy of that information? And how do we put it all together so that at the national and the regional and global scales, we can be talking about the values of the things that we can see in the landscape? So I don't know whether that responds to your question. I mean, certainly that's the big picture I would like to see us somehow addressing. I'd love to describe all life on Earth as well, but that, I think, is probably a more burning issue right now in the second decade of the 21st century.
Okay. Thanks, Donald. Yeah, I think that was an interesting reflection on those questions. I don't have other questions coming in, so I'm going to thank Donald for his time. I don't want to say this morning, but this afternoon. And let's see, I will let you know that our next seminar will take us away from the history series. We'll be talking about data cleaning. This is a seminar by request. And excuse me, but it'll have to be me again. But I'm going to go through kind of a very basic primer on data cleaning, essentially what is a basic protocol that one might follow to do an adequate, at least beginning to cleaning up a data set. So that will be 30th of June at 9 a.m. Chicago time, Central US time, and you can figure out your time zone based on that. So that will take us kind of back into data management. But we have seminars coming up on a history of biodiversity data visualization and a history of place prioritization algorithms. And so that'll all be feeding into our longer series on history of biodiversity and informatics. So for the moment, Donald, many thanks.
Thank you.
Seminar was quite informative and quite useful in thinking about how this one massive data source has evolved through time. So thanks very much.
Thank you. And any questions people have, feel free to, well, obviously route them through you if that's more appropriate, but I'm always happy to try to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks again.
Thanks very much.